Episode 1: The Forest of the White Gown Maid. The Blackwood Forest in Oregon is a place where the trees grow so densely that sunlight rarely penetrates. But it is famous not for its natural darkness, but for the story of Alara, a young maid who was brutally murdered and improperly buried here in the 1880s. Legend has it that her soul is trapped, forever clad in an old white gown, wandering the woods, searching for fragments of her memory and something to fill her emptiness. The present year. 4 friends, seasoned local hunters, Mark, Jake, Ben, and Danny, decide to hold a hunting and camping trip deep within the Forbidden Woods, a place locals swore only fools would enter. Their goal was to hunt deer and prove that the ghost stories were just tall tales. They set up camp in a small clearing. The first evening passed with beer and laughter, but as the night deepened, Mark, who was on watch, heard a muffled sob. The sound was not of an animal, but the weeping of a woman, carried by the wind and abruptly cut short. They searched, but found nothing but dark tree trunks. Jake laughed loudly, dismissing it as an owl. However, when they returned to the tent, they found Danny's sleeping bag neatly made up, and resting upon it was a strange item, an antique, rusty silver hair clasp. None of them knew where it came from. On the second night, things turned serious. Jake woke up from a nightmare. He saw Ben standing outside the tent, staring intently into the trees. "What are you doing, Ben?" Jake asked. Ben didn't answer. He simply raised his hand, as if waving at someone. Jake followed Ben's gaze and saw a tall, slender, blurry white figure gliding between the trees. It didn't move like a walking person. It slid. Jake called Ben louder, but Ben only turned back with vacant eyes and a strange smile. Then, Ben turned around and walked straight into the forest without looking back. The next morning, Ben was gone. They searched for hours, finding only Ben's footprints stopping abruptly in the moss, with no further trace. The most terrifying thing was when they returned to the camp. On Ben's empty sleeping bag lay something else, a tattered, yellowed white apron with unidentifiable stains. Fear had replaced their bravado. Mark, the most rational, tried to convince Jake and Danny to leave, but Danny shook his head, his face pale. "It's not her," Danny whispered. "It's not the maid's ghost killing Ben. She's just the bait." Danny explained that he had read about other disappearances in the Blackwood. They always found a woman's item at the scene, but never a body. It was as if something else was pretending to be the cursed spirit to lure in intruders. On the third night, they decided not to sleep. They sat by the fire, guns on their laps. Around midnight, they heard a loud noise in the distance, like something heavy being dragged over the dry leaves. As they prepared to shoot, the maid's old white dress suddenly dropped from a tree branch right in front of them. It wasn't blown by the wind. It was released. Simultaneously, a sound came from behind them. Jake whirled around, shining his flashlight directly onto a tall, large creature, humanoid in shape but pale-skinned, naked, and eyeless. It stood still, but its whole body trembled violently, as if struggling to suppress a tremendous power. The creature was not a ghost. It was something the forest had absorbed and warped. Danny, paralyzed by terror, couldn't move. Mark, though afraid, raised his gun, but before he could pull the trigger, the creature lunged at Danny with impossible speed. Mark heard a crunch of bone and a stifled scream. When he shone the flashlight back, Danny was gone. The creature was gone too, leaving only the white dress, neatly folded beside Danny's sleeping bag. This time, the dress was tidier, as if someone had just worn it and taken it off. Mark realized he was the last one. He threw his gun and ran for his life. As he ran, he felt something clinging to his back. He brushed it off and kept running. The next morning, rangers found Mark, severely traumatized and mentally broken. He constantly mumbled about the maid in the shadow. They never found Jake, Danny, or Ben, but stitched onto the back of Mark's jacket, they found something that wasn't his. A piece of faded white lace sewn with a black thread, like a final, ominous gift. The white dress wasn't the spirit. It was the cage, the trap, the cloak that the thing within the woods used to conceal itself. Episode 2. The Call from the Obsolete Radio Station. Hello, I am your storyteller. Listen closely to the tale of a place where the silence is more terrifying than any scream. The KQED-AM radio station. Situated deep in the desolate outlands of Nebraska, this is a brick building, abandoned for over 3 decades after a technical malfunction that was never fully explained. The surrounding area has become synonymous with strange disappearances. Passers-by suddenly veer off the highway, never to be seen again. Yet, on one cold, pitch-black night, a young radio host named Elias was hired to restart the station. His job was to broadcast archived classical music and old news reports. The work was easy, the pay was good, but there was one condition. He had to work the night shift, alone. For the first few weeks, everything was chillingly normal. Only the static hum of the old machinery and the symphonies of Beethoven kept him company. Until one night, around 3 a.m. Well, as Elias was making coffee, a strange sound pierced his headphones. It wasn't the usual static, it was a voice. The voice was very faint, thin, as if coming from a great distance, distorted by the static, but still discernible. It was the voice of a young woman whispering, a terrified whisper. "Is anyone there? I'm lost. So lost in the darkness." Elias dismissed it as some amateur radio interference. He checked the control panel. The frequencies were stable. He tried to call back, but only static responded. The next day when he returned to the studio, something had shifted. On the usually tidy desk, the silver Zippo lighter he always kept in his jacket pocket was sitting neatly next to the microphone. Elias was certain he had taken it home. A chill ran down his spine, but he rationalized it as a simple lapse of memory. The following night, the voice returned, clearer this time, and filled with more despair. She described a scene. Tall grass, cold dew. I see shadows. They are moving. They are not human. Elias nearly froze. He tried to record it, but the moment he pressed the button, the voice vanished. He decided not to tell anyone, but the real dread came that morning. His car keys, always hung on the hook, were lying on the floor right beneath his chair. This time, they weren't just displaced. They bore a deep scratch, seemingly scraped by something sharp. The climax occurred on the 3rd night. Elias was equipped with a voice recorder, a camera, and a small hunting knife. He sat in the darkness, waiting. Precisely at 3:07 a.m., the voice echoed again. But this time it was no longer a general cry for help. "Elias, can you hear me?" His heart nearly stopped. He recognized this voice. It was Sarah, his former fiancée, who had mysteriously disappeared during a hiking trip in the northern woods 6 years ago. The police never found her, concluding it was an unfortunate accident. "You can't find me," Sarah's voice whispered, sounding like she was sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm in a place where the light never touches. I see you. I see you sitting there. They told me you would come." Elias screamed into the microphone. "Sarah! Where are you? What's holding you?" Her voice trembled. "The shadow. They took my shoes and my bracelet. And now—" Suddenly, the voice was cut short by a deep, heavy, non-human growl that echoed through the frequency, followed by Sarah's shattering, high-pitched scream. Elias panicked. He turned on the lights, desperately trying to contact the police, but the phone line was dead. He rushed to the door, the knob icy cold. It was locked. Not from the inside, but from the outside. He pounded on the door frantically, but the old building only swallowed his cries. He turned back to the control panel. Sarah's voice was gone. Only the monotonous static remained. But on the desk, where the lighter had appeared before, was a new item. The heart-shaped necklace Elias had given Sarah 6 years ago. He picked it up. The metal was chillingly cold. Just then, he noticed on the oscilloscope screen, the silent sound waves suddenly began to dance wildly. They weren't voices or static. They were the rhythmic pulses of something knocking on the studio door right behind him. A slow, heavy, and deliberate rhythm. Elias slowly turned around, the cold necklace in his hand. In the dark glass of the studio window, a tall, gaunt, black figure was standing there. It had no face, only long, bony hands tapping the glass. And over the radio frequency, the static silence suddenly became a single, chilling whisper. Not Sarah's, but that of the shadow itself. "Now it's your turn to find me." Episode 3. Apartment 333 and the Vanishing Mirror. Welcome to an old apartment complex in the Lower East Side of New York, a place where history is written in rot and secrets. Our story centers on apartment 333, the site of the infamous disappearance of the Miller family in 1978. There were no signs of forced entry, no suicide note, just a half-eaten dinner table and an empty bed. Since then, the apartment has been sealed off, rumored to harbor an entity that does not belong to this world. Our two main characters, Liam and Clara, a young couple, rented the apartment for its suspiciously low price, ignoring the warnings. They were skeptics, believing everything could be explained by logic. Soon after moving in, they noticed the apartment had an unsettling coldness, even when the furnace was running full blast. Liam, a designer, decided to tear down an old plaster wall to expand the living room space. Hidden behind the plaster, they found a hollow cavity, and inside, leaning against the wall, was a heavy antique mirror with thick, dark-stained carved wood edges. The mirror seemed to have been discarded or deliberately hidden. They decided to hang it on the wall opposite the entrance. From the moment the mirror was hung, Clara felt something was wrong. Their reflections in the mirror were not perfectly synchronized with their actions. For example, when Liam walked by, his reflection would be a fraction of a second slower, as if it needed time to catch up to reality. Sometimes Clara's reflection would blink before she did. These minor discrepancies quickly escalated into horror. One evening, as Clara sat on the sofa, she looked into the mirror and saw her own reflection. She smiled, but the reflection did not smile back. It just stared at her with fearful eyes, and then she saw her reflection pounding its fists violently against the glass surface, while the real Clara remained completely still. Clara screamed and called Liam. By the time he arrived, the reflection was back to normal. Liam initially thought it was stress and trick of the light, but then he began to see it too. He looked into the mirror and saw Clara's reflection, but she was weeping, her face contorted in terror. and she was desperately trying to scribble something onto the glass surface with her finger. They realized that those reflections were not mere duplicates of themselves. They were other people, trapped inside the mirror, desperately trying to communicate, to warn. The climax of the events occurred on Saturday night. Liam woke up to a faint noise. Clara was not lying next to him. He got out of bed and saw the living room light was on. As he walked in, he found Clara standing in front of the mirror. She was staring blankly at her own image. Liam called her name, but she didn't respond. He walked closer. He saw Clara's reflection in the mirror, smiling, a wide, terrifying grin, with eyes twinkling maliciously. But the real Clara stood there, her face completely empty, devoid of expression. "Clara, what's wrong?" Liam asked, terrified. The moment he touched her shoulder, the reflection in the mirror suddenly closed its eyes. Liam stared at Clara in shock. She stood there for one more second, then her body collapsed into an empty heap of clothes on the floor. Liam screamed, backing away. He looked up at the mirror. The mirror was still there, but it was utterly blank. There was no reflection whatsoever of the room or of Liam. Nothing but a pitch-black, cold glass surface, swallowing all light. Liam lunged toward the mirror, slamming his fist against it. He felt his hand hit a solid surface, but saw no reflection of his hand. He ran to Clara's clothes, picking up her shirt, his hands trembling. On the floor, right where Clara stood, were only her clothes and a tiny shard of glass broken off from the mirror frame. Liam turned back to the mirror. For a brief moment, he saw it. Behind the black glass, he saw a dim, murky room, and a feminine silhouette standing there, facing away from him, wearing an old 70s dress. It was Clara, but she was in another place. And then he heard a sound, not from the front, but from behind him. It was the sound of the old wooden apartment door latching shut with a loud click. He was locked in. He turned back to the mirror one last time, and right on the black surface, he saw a single word written in condensation. Welcome. Liam had become the new reflection. Episode 4. The Curse of the Porcelain Doll. Our story begins in Richmond, Virginia, a place famous for its old houses and secret antique auctions. The main character is Arthur Davies, a wealthy but lonely antique collector. He is obsessed with objects bearing tragic histories. During a midnight auction, Arthur acquired a life-sized porcelain doll. This doll was particularly unsettling. It wore a faded white lace dress and had neatly braided blonde hair, but its eyes, its striking sapphire blue eyes, were horrifically bright, seeming to peer directly into one's soul. The doll was rumored to have belonged to Lily, an 8-year-old girl who vanished without a trace from her home in 1972. Immediately after bringing the doll back to his luxurious mansion, Arthur began experiencing vivid, recurring nightmares. In his dreams, he found himself in an old, dark house, utterly empty and decaying. He heard the giggling of a little girl and her voice calling out, "Uncle Arthur, it's your turn to hide." He was always playing hide and seek with the girl in his dreams. But no matter where he hid, the girl instantly found him. And when she did, she never spoke, but only stood there, staring at him with those glittering blue eyes, before Arthur would wake up with a jolt, drenched in sweat. Simultaneously, the doll began exhibiting strange behavior. Arthur always placed it on an armchair in his locked display room, but he started finding it in different locations throughout the house. One morning, he found it sitting on the staircase landing. Another time, it was leaning against his bathroom door, always in places he hadn't put it. The dread intensified as living things began to disappear. Arthur's beloved canary, which he had owned for over 10 years, suddenly vanished from its cage. The cage door remained locked, but the bird was gone. leaving behind only a small piece of silk cut from the doll's dress lying at the bottom of the cage. Arthur began to panic. He decided to lock the doll in a sturdy glass cabinet. He covered it completely with a black cloth. However, that night, the dream grew worse. This time, when Arthur hid in the dream, the little girl Lily couldn't find him. Instead, he heard her sobbing, disappointed. He went looking for her in the decaying house. He found her sitting in a dark corner, holding something small and soft in her hands. "You couldn't find me," the girl said sadly. "Now you have to give back what I lost." She opened her hands. Inside was Arthur's dead canary, its feathers neatly tied with a thin silk thread. Immediately after he woke up, Arthur ran, trembling, to the glass cabinet. The black cloth had been pulled down. The doll was still there, but its head was turned towards him, and on its porcelain lips there was a small crack that seemed to have just appeared. He intended to smash the cabinet and destroy the doll, but he hesitated. He looked into those brilliant blue eyes and felt a compelling force, an inexplicable desire to keep playing. Arthur began isolating himself from friends and staff. He spent all his time in the display room with the doll. One night he placed it on the armchair and sat opposite it. He began to ask, his voice shaky, "Lily, what do you want from me?" There was no answer, only silence emanating from the cold porcelain surface. But then, out of the silence, a tiny sound, like metal scraping porcelain, resonated. It was a whisper, coming from the doll's cracked lips. "I want a playmate." Right after that statement, all the lights in the display room flickered out. Arthur was plunged into complete darkness. He heard the clatter-clatter of porcelain on the wooden floor and the faint giggling of a little girl running around the room. He fumbled for his flashlight. He swept it across the room. The doll was no longer in the chair. He heard someone breathing heavily and tiny footsteps scurrying behind him. He turned, but saw nothing. He realized the game of hide-and-seek had begun in the real world. He desperately ran towards the door, but as he reached for the knob, he felt something latch onto his ankle. He looked down. It was the doll's tiny porcelain hand gripping his ankle tightly. He bent down, trying to pry it off, but the porcelain grip was surprisingly strong. Just then, he felt a heavy weight descend onto his back. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was the little girl, Lily. She had found him. In his final moments of lucidity, Arthur heard a last whisper, right next to his ear. Not in the little girl's voice, but a deep, cold voice of something ancient and malevolent. "Now you belong to me." The next morning, the police arrived to investigate Arthur Davies' disappearance. They found the mansion empty, with no signs of struggle or forced entry. On the armchair in the display room, the porcelain doll Lily sat there, her blue eyes brighter than ever. And on the desk, there was a new item. Arthur's gold wedding ring, placed neatly in the doll's cold porcelain palm. Arthur had become just another toy in the girl's eternal collection. Episode 5. The Abandoned Subway Tunnel. In Chicago, beneath the bustling avenues, lies a network of old subway tunnels, abandoned for decades. Although the power was cut and the tracks removed in many sections, urban legends persist about the Phantom Line, a secret route where passengers suddenly vanish without explanation. Our protagonists are Subterranea, Chloe, a young, daring documentary filmmaker, Marcus, the cameraman, and Sam, the audio expert. Their goal is to explore and record evidence of the ghost stories at one of the sealed entrances to this tunnel system. After finding a secret entrance beneath an old warehouse, the Subterranea crew descended deep underground. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled of rusted metal.
They walked along tracks covered in dust and sludge. Immediately, Chloe noticed things that were out of the ordinary. On the concrete walls, there wasn't just graffiti, but strange carved markings.
They didn't resemble writing or art. They were spiral geometric shapes, circles cut in half, and gaunt human figures with raised hands. Sam, the audio expert, continuously complained about unexplained static in his headphones. Venturing deeper, they reached a wider section of the tunnel where they discovered a chilling sight. Dozens of old suitcases and travel bags stacked along the wall. They were all tagged with names and destinations the crew couldn't recognize, as if these passengers had just managed to drop their luggage before going somewhere they would never return from. As Marcus was getting a close-up shot of a tattered suitcase, his flashlight began to flicker. At the same moment, Sam yelled, "Noise! I hear a loud noise. It sounds like—" And then they all heard it. An impossible sound. The sound of a subway horn echoed from deep within the dark tunnel ahead, a long, low, reverberating blast, strong enough to shake the cold air. All three stood frozen in shock.
Chloe stammered, "No way."
The tracks were cut 40 years ago. There's no power. The horn went silent, but was replaced by the screech of metal grinding against metal. The sound of train wheels running on tracks. The sound clearly approached them. Sam, completely panicked, pointed at his audio console. The screen showed a massive sound frequency, as if a large object were approaching. Yet, when they shone their flashlights, the tunnel remained empty. They decided to flee. Turning around, they started running back towards the exit, but the sound of the subway seemed to be running parallel to them, keeping pace, not ahead, but right alongside them. Suddenly, Marcus tripped. Chloe turned back to help him. Just then, Sam, running right ahead of them, suddenly stopped. He turned his head, looking straight at Chloe and Marcus. His face was no longer Sam's. It was contorted, his eyes wide with extreme terror. Yet, he wore an involuntary, wide, unnatural grin. Before Chloe could ask, an invisible hand seemed to grip Sam's ankle. Chloe and Marcus watched as Sam was jerked backward with terrifying force, sliding across the dusty tracks. Marcus tried to keep filming. Right in the frame, he captured an unbelievable moment. The section of the tunnel behind Sam was suddenly swallowed by a dense, pitch-black wall. Not ordinary darkness, but a new, endless, terrifyingly deep corridor, utterly alien. Sam was dragged into that corridor, and the dark wall sealed shut behind him, like a closing door. Only Chloe and Marcus remained, trembling and holding their breath. They stood there, not daring to run further, and then they heard it. The subway. But this time, it was more than just sound. From the darkness ahead, a dirty, flickering yellow light began to appear. An old, rusty subway train with blacked-out windows was approaching. The train made no sound except for the terrifying creaking of metal. As it rolled past them, Chloe and Marcus pressed themselves against the wall, trying to shine their flashlights into the windows. Inside the cars, they saw passengers. They weren't ghosts, but people sitting motionless, in outdated clothes, their faces pale, all staring straight ahead with wide, empty eyes. They were the missing people. And then, in the very last window, Chloe saw a familiar face. It was Sam sitting there. He stared straight at her, and for a brief moment, she saw him open his mouth wide, trying to scream, but no sound escaped. As the final car rolled past, the train horn blasted one last time, this time right next to their ears. And then, the train vanished into the darkness, as if it had never existed. Chloe and Marcus found the exit. They never spoke of the trip again,
and the footage was destroyed by Marcus in his panic.
However, when Chloe washed her dust-covered jacket, she found something in her pocket. An old subway ticket detailing the route and date. Phantom Line, 1978. Episode 6. The old camera that took pre-disappearance photos. Our story focuses on Emily, a freelance photographer in Seattle who hunts for stories of mysterious disappearances for an online blog. During a visit to a small antique shop, she was drawn to an old Polaroid camera, the kind that develops pictures instantly. The camera was neglected, dusty, and had an inscription carved into its body that Emily couldn't decipher. She bought it for a cheap price, hoping to find interesting old photos inside. The camera had no film, so Emily bought a new pack and started experimenting. Initially, everything seemed normal. The strangeness began when Emily took her first test photo, a shot of a street-side cafe she frequented. When the picture printed, Emily noticed something odd. The photo captured the cafe as it was, with the current customers. But in the far corner, there was an additional man she was certain was not present when she took the photo. The man was standing with his back to her, but his posture was one of sheer panic. Emily initially thought it might be a technical glitch with the old film. She took a second photo, this time of a park. Again, a woman appeared in the frame, staring directly into the lens with desperate eyes, her mouth agape as if screaming. Emily started investigating. She searched online for recent disappearances in the Seattle area and was shocked. The man in the first photo had vanished one day after the photo was taken. The woman in the second photo had also disappeared that very morning. This camera didn't just capture the present moment. It captured the moment just before they disappeared. Emily continued her experiments, this time with a growing sense of dread. She photographed a stranger walking across the street, a completely ordinary person. In the Polaroid picture, the person stood there, but their face was distorted by extreme fear, and there was a strange red mark around their neck. Emily tried to warn these people, but they dismissed her as crazy. And as predicted, within hours of the photo being taken, those people became new missing persons files on local news. When Emily took a photo of an empty street corner, no one appeared in the printed picture. Instead, there was a bony, gaunt hand, reaching out from a dense shadow in the corner, as if waiting for prey. Emily realized that the people in the photos weren't ghosts. They were real people, being captured, trapped in a moment of time where they knew their terrifying fate was imminent. The camera was a portal peering through the veil of time, showing the final instant of desperation. Obsession and guilt weighed heavily on Emily. She realized she couldn't stop the disappearances. She could only witness them. One evening, Emily decided to do something reckless. She pointed the camera at herself, turned on the flash, and took a selfie in the bathroom mirror. She wanted to know what awaited her. The camera made a click and printed the photo. Emily snatched it up, her heart pounding in her chest. In the photo, it was herself standing in the bathroom. But she wasn't still. Her face in the picture was contorted by horror, her eyes pleading for help. She was being grabbed by a black, sinewy hand clutching her wrist, dragging her backward into the thick darkness that was flooding the corner of the bathroom. And the most terrifying thing was that her reflection in the mirror, her actual reflection, was smiling, a look of satisfied malevolence, while the real Emily continued to stare wide-eyed at the photograph. Emily dropped the Polaroid picture. She turned back to look at the old camera, and for the first time, she saw the carved inscription on its body faintly glow. She tried to run out of the bathroom, but the moment she touched the doorknob, the entire room plunged into darkness. The light suddenly went out. In the thick darkness, Emily heard the clacking sound of the old Polaroid camera automatically printing one more photo. Then came another sound, a labored, gasping breath right behind her, a cold breath that smelled of damp earth and rust. Emily didn't dare turn around. She struggled to twist the doorknob, but it was locked shut. She heard the zzz, zzz sound of a picture being printed and falling onto the tile floor. Fear dominated all her senses. Emily knew she had to see that photo. She cautiously fumbled around on the floor. Her hand touched the freshly printed picture, which was still slightly warm. She used the weak light from her phone screen to look. The final Polaroid. In it, it wasn't Emily being dragged away. Instead, it was an empty corner of the bathroom, and on the floor, an old Polaroid camera lying on its side. No sign of her. No hand. Nothing. Only a small piece of paper placed neatly next to the camera. Emily read the paper with a tremble. "The picture is taken." The moment she finished reading, the black, sinewy hand she had seen in the selfie slowly gripped her wrist from behind. The strength was so immense it took her breath away. Emily's scream was muffled into a weak whimper. Her phone and the Polaroid picture fell to the floor. When the police arrived a few days later, Emily was gone. They only found an old Polaroid camera in the bathroom and a single picture on the floor. That picture was a perfect portrait of Liam, the husband who vanished in episode 3, standing in his dark apartment, staring into the pitch-black mirror. Episode 7, The Cornfield of Deceitful Promises. This story takes place in Kansas, where cornfields stretch endlessly to the horizon, forming a giant green sea that can swallow everything whole. Our protagonists are the Hale family, David the father, Sarah the mother, and their 5-year-old daughter, Elise. They were driving on vacation and decided to take a shortcut through desolate country roads. As night began to fall, their car suddenly got lost in a network of unmarked dirt roads. The car clock was broken, their phones had no signal, and only the headlights illuminated 2 towering walls of corn on either side. They were trapped. After hours of circling, they noticed something strange. Every turn they took brought them back to the same spot. And then, amidst the dark fields, they saw a faint light. A small, old wooden house, seemingly abandoned. While David hesitated, Sarah and Elise ran toward the house. They knocked, and the wooden door creaked open. A frail, elderly woman with an old apron and a frighteningly sweet smile greeted them. She introduced herself as Mrs. May and invited them in to take shelter for the night, promising to give them directions the next morning. Inside, the house was strangely warm, with the smell of baked goods and herbs. Mrs. May told stories about the land, about the failed harvests years ago, and how the locals had to make sacrifices to keep the soil fertile. "Children are the best nutrients," Mrs. May whispered, looking at Elise with an odd, glistening gaze. "They need to sleep under the earth to ensure next year's crop." David and Sarah felt a chill, but they dismissed it as old superstitions. They put Elise to sleep in an old wooden cradle in the corner of the room and collapsed onto the sofa. Around 2 a.m., Sarah was awakened by a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a heavy, rhythmic, rustling sound, as if thousands of corn stalks were being shifted all at once. She looked out the foggy window glass. In the dim moonlight, she saw the tall corn stalks bending and twisting, but not due to the wind. They were moving, slowly, getting closer to the house. It was as if the cornfield was advancing to besiege them. When Sarah looked closer, she saw gaunt black shadows crawling on the ground between the corn rows. They had no distinct shape, but they were dragging something heavy. Sarah turned to David, trying to wake him up, but David was in such a deep sleep she couldn't stir him. In utter terror, Sarah rushed to Elise. She took a deep breath and looked into the wooden cradle. The cradle was empty. Little Elise was gone. Her small blanket was tossed onto the floor, and on the cradle mattress there was a strange mud stain shaped like a small hand. Sarah screamed, but her cry was swallowed by the silence of the house. She turned around. Mrs. May was standing in the doorway of the living room. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her wrinkled face was rigid, her eyes empty and dark as damp earth. "Have you seen my daughter?" Sarah pleaded. Mrs. May simply raised her hand, her bony finger pointing toward the pitch-black cornfield outside. "The harvest has come, my dear," Mrs. May said in a raspy voice, unlike her previous sweet tone. "The earth has been waiting. The plants are hungry." Mrs. May stepped closer, each step making a gritty crunch on the wooden floor, as if she were walking on dry sand. Sarah backed away, seeing something horrifying at Mrs. May's feet. Thick black mud clung to her bare feet, and that mud seemed to be oozing from Mrs. May's skin itself. Mrs. May was not the caretaker of the house. She was a part of the field. Sarah ran back to David and frantically tried to pull him awake. She was desperate. Just then she heard a soft, familiar giggle from outside the window. It was Elise's giggle. She was laughing. Sarah turned to the window. The cornfield filled the glass pane. She saw Elise standing among the corn rows, looking at her, and she was smiling. But there was a horrible detail. A black-green vine was tightly wrapped around her ankle, slowly pulling her deeper into the darkness. And right next to Elise, standing eerily still, was Mrs. May, her wrinkled face now stretched into a ghastly, satisfied grin. Sarah banged on the window glass. Mrs. May simply shook her head, and then Sarah saw the cornstalks in front of Elise begin to bend, obscuring the view. When she turned back, Mrs. May was standing right behind her. She reached out her hand, and in her dirt-filled palm lay a small, cute item, the pink hair tie Elise always wore. "Now, sleep," Mrs. May whispered. The next morning, the Hale family's car was found neatly parked on the roadside, miles away. Inside, David was soundly asleep in the driver's seat, still disoriented and unable to explain what happened. He insisted his wife and daughter were in the car when he fell asleep. Police searched the cornfield for days, but found no trace of Sarah or Elise. Only one thing was certain. At the end of the search day, a police officer found a single, large, ripe ear of corn placed neatly on David's car dashboard, where no corn grew nearby. It was the plentiful harvest the earth had demanded. Episode 8, The Ancient Library and the Blank Book. The Hawthorne Library in Boston is the oldest library in New England, with soaring oak shelves reaching toward the magnificent ceiling. It is not just a repository of knowledge, but a keeper of its own stories. Our protagonist is Eleanor Vance, a young librarian who always works the night shift in the rare books section in the basement. One night, as Eleanor was reorganizing a new batch of rare books transferred from a sealed old archive, she discovered a book with no cover, no title, and absolutely no trace of a publisher. When she opened it, she found all the pages were pristine white, devoid of any writing. She placed it in a separate compartment and continued her work. The following night, when Eleanor returned, she curiously opened the white book. She was stunned. The first page was no longer white. It had been filled with a handwritten passage in old black ink, with perfect calligraphy. The passage described a man in detail, named Thomas Sterling, 42, engineer. Tonight he will leave the pub on Beacon Hill, step down the service stairs, and be swallowed by an indistinct shadow. He will vanish without a single trace. Final belonging, his old pocket watch. Eleanor trembled. She looked up Thomas Sterling's name in the news, and she discovered a horrible fact. Thomas Sterling had been reported missing early that very morning, exactly as the book described. His pocket watch was the only item found on the service stairs. This book was not a history book. It was a prophetic journal of disappearances. From that night onward, a new page was filled every night, detailing another person who had vanished in the city, along with their final moments and the single item they left behind. As Eleanor read these passages at night, she was no longer alone in the library. She began to see faint, almost translucent figures standing silently among the tall bookshelves. They were the spirits of the vanished people recorded in the book. They did not harm her. They simply stood there, staring at her with empty, silent eyes. Once, when she read the passage about a missing female student, Eleanor saw the girl's shadow standing right beside her, reaching out to touch the book, but her hand passed right through the page. Eleanor tried to burn the book, tear it, or throw it away, but the book seemed indestructible. It always returned to its compartment the next morning, unharmed, as if it were a permanent part of the library. Fear turned into obsession. Eleanor began searching for information about the book, about the library's origins. She discovered a shocking truth. The Hawthorne Library was built on the foundation of an ancient chapel, where it was believed an old ritual was performed to collect forgotten memories, to maintain the longevity of knowledge. The blank book was that collector. On a stormy night, Eleanor sat before the book, deciding to read the final blank page. She placed her hand on the paper. Immediately, an icy cold sensation ran down her spine. Black ink began to bleed from the spine, rapidly spreading across the page. The perfect calligraphy reappeared, quickly, unstoppably. Eleanor didn't need to read. She already knew what was being written. It detailed the disappearance of a librarian named Eleanor Vance. The passage recorded the moment she was haunted by the spirits, how she attempted to destroy the book, and how she would enrich the library with her own memories. Eleanor was in utter panic. She stood up, deciding to run, but as she turned her back on the book, she saw that the figures she had once seen were no longer silent. The souls of the missing people had filled the book aisles, all of them advancing toward her. They were no longer translucent. Now they were clearer, their faces desperate, all reaching out toward her, not to harm but to warn, to tell her that she had no escape. Just then she heard a voice, not from the spirits but a low, dry voice echoing from the open book on the table. No one leaves until their story is finished. Eleanor turned back to the book. The final page was completed. The last sentence read, "She shall be stripped of the most precious thing, the memory of herself." Simultaneously, a dense darkness engulfed the library. She felt cold, invisible hands touching her shoulders and head. There was no scream, only a feeling of lightness, of emptiness. Eleanor no longer remembered her name. She didn't remember what she was doing at the library. She was just a lonely, lost consciousness. When dawn broke, the other staff found the Hawthorne Library completely quiet. Eleanor Vance had vanished. Her chair was empty, and on the table the coverless book was pristine white again, ready to record the next disappearance story. However, there was one anomaly. Right on the wooden tabletop, A small item was left behind. Eleanor's silver hair clip, which had been flipped to the final page of the book and clipped tightly to the blank paper. Episode 9. The Lake House and the Reflection Under the Water. Lake Muskegon in Michigan is notorious for its deep waters and chilling legends. Locals claim the lake is home to an ancient entity that lures swimmers and fishermen, dragging them to the bottom to vanish forever. For decades, dozens of people have disappeared on the lake without a trace of their bodies, turning them into souls never found. 4 college friends, Chloe, Ethan, Maya, and Noah, rented an old wooden cabin right on the lakeshore for one last getaway before graduation. They were quickly captivated by the silence and wild beauty of the place. On the very first night, Ethan, who enjoyed gazing out the window, noticed something odd. As he looked out at the still lake under the moonlight, he saw a faint shadow beneath the water's surface. It was the shape of a person standing upright, just below the surface. Initially, he thought it was a reflection of trees or the moon, but as he tried to focus, he saw the shadow move. It waved, a slow, inviting gesture, as if trying to draw him down. Ethan backed away in fear, but by morning, his fear was replaced by Noah's curiosity. Noah, an amateur diver, decided to explore the lake's depth, ignoring the warnings. Noah dived for about 20 minutes. When he resurfaced, his face was ashen, his eyes wide. He was immediately pulled ashore and taken inside the house. Noah had no visible injuries, but he was in a state of mental shock. He was trembling, repeating incoherent phrases. Moss. Everything is moss. They are there. They are waiting. When he calmed down slightly, Noah recounted the horror he had witnessed. He didn't just see the normal lake bottom. At a certain depth, he saw a small, submerged city, completely covered in black-green moss. There were houses, streets, and everyday objects. It was like a neighborhood that had been swallowed hundreds of years ago. And more chillingly, in every window of those moss-covered houses, he saw pale faces looking out. They weren't fish or sea creatures. They were human faces, floating, their long hair tangled around the windows, all waiting, gazing toward the surface, as if anticipating new companions. After Noah's story, the entire group was terrified. They decided to leave first thing in the morning. But that night, Lake Muskegon would not let them go easily. Maya, who was sensitive, was awakened by a distant lullaby, sweet yet sorrowful. She walked out onto the porch. The lake's surface that night had an enchanting look, and on the water's surface, she saw that faint shadow again. But this time, the shadow didn't wave. It slowly rose, stood on the water's surface, and took the form of herself. The Maya in the watery reflection was unclothed. She was soaking wet, her dark hair plastered down, her eyes wide open, and she offered a seductive, silent smile. "Come here, Maya," a voice whispered in her mind. "The water is warm. We will be here forever." Chloe and Ethan woke up to the sound of the door opening. They saw Maya walking across the lawn, heading straight toward the lake. They screamed her name, and Maya stopped. She turned around. Her face was still hers, but her eyes held an expression of profound terror, and she was sobbing uncontrollably. "I can't stop," she whimpered. "She is calling me. She promised to show me their home." Ethan lunged to grab Maya, but the moment he touched her, she convulsed and slipped out of his grasp. She ran straight into the lake. Chloe and Ethan followed. They saw Maya plunge into the water. Just then, the reflected Maya on the water's surface suddenly reached out her wet hands, grabbed the real Maya's wrist, and pulled her under.
Chloe and Ethan watched the water ripple violently for a moment, and then it became eerily still.
When they shined their flashlights, the lake's surface reflected normally again. Just water and darkness. There was no sign of Maya. They had lost 3 friends in just 2 nights. Ethan and Chloe found Noah curled up in a corner, clutching his head, completely detached from the world around him. When the police arrived, they only had Chloe's testimony, an unbelievable story. Like the disappearances before, they found no body for Maya. But right on the lawn, near where Maya stepped into the water, the police found something that wasn't hers. An old, rotting silk evening dress, soaked through with lake water, snagged on a rock. The dress didn't belong to Maya. It belonged to one of the lake's residents, sent up as a thank you, or a replacement. As Chloe left the area, she looked down at the lake one last time. For a moment, she saw a faint face glide past beneath the surface. And it wasn't Maya. It was the face of Eleanor Vance, the librarian from episode 8, staring up at her with silent, lifeless eyes from the depths of the mossy city. The lake doesn't just drown souls, it collects and keeps them. Episode 10, The Hidden Case of the Courier. Every horror story requires one persistent person to pull back the curtain. Our final character is Jonathan Price, a retired private investigator obsessed with unsolved disappearances. He was a skeptic until he began to notice a thin red thread running through all the missing persons files, the stories we covered in previous episodes. Jonathan spent 6 months analyzing the files of Thomas Sterling, episode 8, Ben and Danny, episode 2, Clara, episode 3, and all the others. He discovered an absurd but repetitive detail. Before vanishing, all of them had a small transaction with a little-known shipping company called Void Express. Their final belongings, Elias's lighter, Sarah's necklace, Arthur's wedding ring, were either sent to or delivered by this company. Jonathan found the address of Void Express, an old industrial warehouse located in an uninhabited outskirt of Pennsylvania. He decided to break in at night, armed with a flashlight, a handgun, though he knew it would be useless, and a small voice recorder. The remainder of episode 10 is Jonathan Price's audio log. This is Jonathan Price, date 02:15 a.m. I'm outside the Void Express warehouse, no signs of life. The gate is unlocked. The smell smells like damp earth and rusted metal. I'm inside. It's freezing in here, no power. The roller shutters are down. I'm using my flashlight. This entire massive warehouse is empty, just dust and something else. There are hundreds of spiral markings, like the ones I saw in the subway files, episode 5, painted in black on the floor. I found a small metal door at the back of the warehouse, like a vault door. It's secured with an old combination lock. I tried a few disappearance dates. Thomas Sterling's date, Lily's date, episode 4. No luck. But then I tried 1880, the year the white gown maid disappeared, episode 2. It opened. Inside is a narrow concrete hallway slanting downward. The air smells heavily of ozone, like a recent lightning storm. I'm descending. I think I hear running water, like a lake. I've reached a large circular room deep underground, and here is the truth. This isn't a shipping company. In the center of the room is a massive machine, made of black metal, surrounded by a viscous, dark green liquid. It's not operating, but it's emitting a faint hum. And look, on the far side, there's a stone pedestal. On it is a glass display case. Inside the case are all the final belongings left by the missing people. Elias's Zippo lighter, Sarah's necklace, Ben's old apron, and the Polaroid camera,
Episode 6, is there too. There's a note taped to the box. It reads, "Moments of transition. Property retained." I see a small control panel. I think this is a machine
For teleportation. Not space, but time. No, that's not right. It's a gateway to forgotten places, moments, locations, trapped outside of reality. I believe Void Express doesn't ship goods. They ship people to those places to store them, or to feed something. I just touched the control panel. The screen lit up. There's a list of destinations. Phantom Line, 1978. Hawthorne Library, Collection. Lake Muskegon, Moss City. My God, those disappearances were real, and they were orchestrated by something. Noise. The metal door above is opening. Someone is coming. I have to hide. I'm crouching behind the machine. It's not staff. It's a gaunt, tall figure, like the shadow that dragged Emily, Episode 6, and the shadows in the cornfield, Episode 7. It's wearing an old gray Void Express delivery coat. It seems to be checking inventory. It's getting closer. It's looking at the glass box. It's picking up Eleanor's silver hair clip, Episode 8. It's smiling. Even though it has no face, I can feel it smiling. It's looking right at me. It knows I'm here. It's walking toward me. Jonathan's high-pitched, muffled scream. A deafening screech of metal grinding hard, followed by a massive metallic slam, like a colossal door closing. Then, absolute silence. The log ends with the static hum of the machine. A week later, the voice recorder was found on the floor of the Void Express warehouse, next to the locked vault door. Jonathan Price became Missing Persons File Number 10. There was no evidence of the displacement machine, no suitcases, nor any belongings of the missing. Everything had vanished, but on the voice recorder, police found a tiny item clipped to it, a single gray hair, matted with mud and moss, tied with a small black thread. That thread seemed to be taken from the old apron of the white gown maid, Episode 2. And that metal door remained, tightly locked. The series concludes. The door has shut, but the missing remain in a place we cannot reach.